This morning, we're going to try and tackle chapter 5 and chapter 6. My voice might sound a little weird. I'm a little nasally, but I'm good. And so if you have comments, please say them. You're going to help me out a ton. I got some water here going to help me out. But if you got any comments, feel free. Just to remind us where we've been, chapter 1 was sort of the prologue, and Solomon says life is meaningless. Life without God is absolutely meaningless. And so he goes on this quest to try and find fulfillment under the sun. In chapter 2, you see wealth of pleasures, you see wisdom, earthly knowledge, and work. And his conclusion is, this isn't worth it. This is absolutely pointless, and I'm just going to die. So what's the point in all these labors and pleasures and all these things that I'm doing? Chapter 3, we see Solomon almost take a step back, and he says, you know what? There's a time for everything under the sun. In chapter 3, there's all those times for this, time for that. And you know what? Life's really predictable that these things are going to happen, but it's really unpredictable, as in you don't know when it's going to happen or when it's going to happen to you. And so he was saying, so what's the point? No matter what you do, these things are going to happen, whether it's in your lifetime or not. What's the point? And all along the way, we get these little dots of God showing up in the picture. And he said, what God does lasts forever, but what I do is very temporary and not that meaningful at all. And so last week we were in chapter 4, which was a very dismal chapter, wasn't it? We were talking about oppression. We were talking about labor under the sun, how it is good to have companionship in business and relationships, stuff like that. And then earthly power and oppression that can come from power. We didn't see God mentioned once in chapter 4. That was a really dismal picture. But here in chapter 5, we're going to see God shows up a lot. It's going to be really different from what we read in chapter 4. Okay, so any thoughts or anything before we dive into chapter 5? Okay. Well, let's dive in here. Chapter 5. Let's read the first 7 verses together, please. And we're going to see that God specifically is mentioned 7 times in these verses, in these 7 verses. So let's read these first 7 verses. Guard your steps as you go to the house of God. Draw near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know they are doing evil. Do not be hasty in word or impulsive in thought to bring up a matter in the presence of God. For God is in heaven and you are on the earth. Therefore, let your words be few. For the dream comes through much effort, and the voice of a fool through many words. When you make a vow to God, do not be late in paying it, for he takes no delight in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than you should vow and not pay. Do not let your speech cause you to sin, and do not say in the presence of the messenger of God that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry on account of your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For in many dreams and in many words there is emptiness. Rather, fear God. So again, in these first 7 verses, we see God mentioned a bunch, don't we? And we just finished a chapter where he wasn't mentioned at all. And so God being mentioned a bunch is highly significant. And so in verses 1 through 3 specifically here, we see in the house of God. You know, when you enter the house of God, when you come in the house of God, verse 1 says, guard your steps. And some different translations render that differently, but guard your steps, tread softly in approaching the house of God and approaching the presence of God. And why do you think that is? Why do you think Solomon switches from all these things really don't matter to, okay, it really matters how you approach the house of God, the presence of God? Any thoughts on any of that? Well, he's God. I mean, yeah, definitely, for sure. Anything else?
My mind goes to, I was just listening the other day to something about Ananias and Sapphira. And obviously, in the book of Acts, there are people who have great wealth.
Mm.
And when they come to the house of God, they act frivolously, they act deceitfully, and it's to their detriment. And so Solomon has just gotten done talking about all this great wealth, and all of these things he's accumulated. And so now it comes to the time of the house of God, and this is the serious part. In whatever state you arrive, this is the serious part.
Yeah, this is the serious part. Because he's God, it's serious now. And I think what we see is a giant contrast between all these things that are fleeting, that are useless, that are meaningless, and have no substance. And all of a sudden, here's this character that has substance, has meaning, and it's like, when you approach this, and I'm saying this, you know what I mean. When you approach this is something that is lasting. So your words matter, how you approach matters, all those things all of a sudden start to matter. Yes, sir?
I like that. I also think back, the main thing is, you're not worthy.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And floods were brought out and came to Mount Sinai. God said, put a fence around it. You don't come near me,
Mhm.
because you're not, I'm gonna let Moses, my servant, do this. And he did the same thing. Yeah, we see the same thing, that's sort of a foreshadowing of tabernacle. Where if you have only the priests are allowed in here, and we only have the high priest, we're actually in the holy of holies.
Mhm.
Say, you don't come here, you're not worthy.
Yeah.
Let's do it one day here. But get in, you're not in there for very long.
Mhm.
I think that always has been good, our mindset when we approach God. We have to humble ourselves to be not.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not worthy. And that's going to be a huge thing, I think, in Ecclesiastes. Because here is Solomon trying everything under the sun without God to find fulfillment, to find meaning. And so far, he's been saying, I've been trying this stuff and it's not lasting. It has no meaning. These things are not worthy for me to put my whole being into and my identity into. But then all of a sudden, he makes this big pivot. So I think you're exactly right that here's God who is worthy, even if at this point he doesn't recognize the fullness of that. He recognizes a little bit. That's all you've got to know about God, by the way, is a little bit to realize, okay, I need to tread softly. I need to guard my steps as I approach the presence of God. Yes, sir?
Um, Response specifically, but especially for the Annas and Sapphira. Well, I'm always struck. I look up the names, I don't remember his name, but King Amaziah in Judah, he was described he was described as, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, yet is not of his full heart.
Mm.
And what a sad, scary way to be described in scripture. But I feel like that's oftentimes like so close to what the lukewarmness of a modern day church looks like.
Yes.
And to me, what stands out too is the word prudently, because the implication of the definition of prudence is to be future focused. So this idea that you're worried about the impact of what you're doing now, you're thinking forward in a very intentional way. It sets the tenor for how you go into worship so much differently than if you're just in here now pulling the pew just for the sake of sitting.
Yeah, where does yours say prudent? What verse is that?
That's in one.
Verse one.
Prudently, when you
Oh, okay.
go to the house of God.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. So we've got guard your steps, tread softly, and what was it?
Walk prudently.
Walk prudently. I like that a lot. Yeah. And all of that stems from what Brett was talking about, what Adam was talking about, and what Dan was talking about. God is worthy. He is God. And really, if we miss that, we're going to miss a lot of things. But just comparing this to what Solomon's been talking about here in Ecclesiastes is here's all of these things in life under the sun. Without God, they're not lasting. But then when you realize just a smidge of who God is, you realize that he is lasting and the things that you do before him are lasting. So things that you do before him, here he says, draw near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they don't know that they're doing evil. And I think we get an interpretation for what that sacrifice of fools is in the following verses. It's these words that maybe they don't really mean what they think they mean, or they haven't thought through what these words that they're saying actually mean, because they're hasty in verse 2, they're impulsive in thought to bring up a matter. And he says, God is in heaven and you're on the earth, so let your words be few. Let your words be few. And it's funny because we're doing this in a Bible class and I want people to talk. So, it's like, let your words be few. Don't you say anything. You better make sure that you think about it. And that's absolutely true. But here we're talking about approaching God, and when we approach God and his presence in that way. Here in a couple of these verses here, again, this is different than what we've seen because this is lasting. Our words that we speak in the presence of God are lasting compared to all these things that are fleeting and unfulfilling and don't mean anything. And so he says, don't be hasty, because this stuff lasts longer than the material world even lasts. I'm hesitant because I don't want to bring in too much New Testament stuff here, but in verses 4-7, he starts talking about vows. We make vows to each other, promises. We do stuff like that. When you get married, you make vows to your partner. And he's saying, if you make a vow to God, your words matter. God is lasting. And if you make a vow to God, that is something that is not fleeting. That's not something that lacks substance. That's not something that is wind. That is something that is lasting beyond this material world. And he says, don't be late in paying it because he takes no delight in fools. And so I think that connects back to the first couple of verses there too, where a fool will hastily make a vow before God, sort of, I think someone said the word frivolous, frivolously, not realizing the weight and recognizing the lasting value of a vow before God. And if we do that and don't pay it, Solomon says you're in for a world of hurt because that lasts, because God lasts. Pay what you vow. So verse 5, he says it's better that you shouldn't vow. Like, don't even make a vow than to make a vow and not pay it. And so he says, verse 6, don't let your speech cause you to sin. Don't say in the presence of a messenger of God, oh, that was a mistake. I didn't really mean that. Well, if you make a vow to God, it's important, it's lasting. And so he has a question here in verse 6. We've been looking at a lot of these questions. Verse 6, though, why should God be angry on account of your voice and destroy the work of your hands? And so on this, I mean, vows are serious. They're lasting. I just think about how many movies have you seen or TV shows or books have you read, or maybe in your own life experience, have you said or heard somebody say, God, if you just let this job work out, I'm going to give my life to you. Anybody in here ever said that or thought that before? You just let this job work out and I'm going to live my life for you. Or maybe you see these pictures of people on the ocean and like the waves are tempestuous and things are going really bad. And somebody says, God, if you just let me through this storm, I'm going to live my life for you. I don't know about you all, but I have thought things like that before. And then what usually happens, as soon as something works out in your favor, even if it doesn't, that thing is gone from your mind. Anybody else been there before? I've been there. But there are other times in my life where, hey, I say something like that and I mean it, and I'm still living it to this day. But there are other times, I don't know if you're like me or you're like these TV shows or movies, but that happens so often. And again, I don't want to bring too much New Testament into this, but let your yes be yes, let your no be no. You know, if we say things, we should keep them. And especially if we're making promises, vows in the presence of God to God, when God is in the picture, it's lasting, it's meaningful beyond this physical universe. And so that's why Solomon says, tread softly, guard your steps, walk prudently. It matters. God matters. He is lasting. Any thoughts on really verses 1 through 7? The messenger in verse 6? In verse 6? Let's see, the presence of the messenger of God. I assume in this, because he was talking about the house of God and coming into the house of God, that it would be some form of priest or Levite. It's possible that it's a prophet here. We see prophets called the messengers of God. And do what? That's not my first inclination, but I could be wrong. But yeah, but especially because he says the house of God, draw near to listen, I assume that it's someone in the house of God. Any other thoughts on that or anything else here in verses 1 through 7?
It's not that basically you made a vow and I don't come and make an excuse for it,
Mm-hmm.
even before the priest or the prophet.
Mm-hmm.
Don't make an excuse back out.
Yeah, exactly. You made a vow, pay what you owe, pay what you owe. Yes, sir.
The first part of what was talked about here, and I mean, the open thought, it really reminds me of the book of Job. That the highlight of the Job and his, in the big four friends, the highlight is the 7 days where nobody said anything.
Mm-hmm.
And then it went downhill from there, where they were all trying to estimate and understand, this is what God is doing, this is why this is happening. And then at the end, it got much, much better because Job is the one who says, I will shut my mouth and listen to what you have to say.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way this strikes me, is when we're talking with God, which we should be, we need to spend a lot more time listening than we do to talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great parallel to Job because you're exactly right. When there's silence, things go a little bit better in that passage. Anything else? Verses 1 through 7?
The severity and reverence around vows, we know God takes so seriously, and that's like demonstrated again and again and again, especially with his vows towards us, that you can never go back and promise. But
Mhm.
I always think of it as like the worst case scenario of Jephthah
Oh, yeah.
making the vow to God to win against the Ammonites and then having to sacrifice his daughter.
Yeah.
And like that's the intensity in which God and the seriousness in which God takes vows and Moses. So being very careful in what we do promise to God, because we know that he will
Yeah, that's a really good example, especially of being hasty in making a vow. I mean, he never, I don't believe for a second that he thought, yeah, my daughter might be the first living thing to come out of my house. And if he did, there's no way.
It's a, and
For sure.
especially knowing the potential consequences which end up turning out.
Yeah, absolutely. He was hasty and impulsive in making that vow, and God takes vows seriously. Okay, well, let's keep going here. What's interesting about verses 8 and 9 is that in some translations, verses 8 and 9 are connected to verses 1 through 7. And in other translations, they are connected to verses 10 through, I think, 17. And so some people connect the thought with verses 1 through 7, and other people connect the thought with verses 10 through 17. And I'm going to try and explore both of those because either way, it's going to be true, regardless of which section it's attached to. But let's read verses 8 and 9, please. If you see oppression of the poor and denial of justice and righteousness in the province, do not be shocked at the sight. For one official watches over another official, and there are higher officials over them. After all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. And so here we see that oppression and corruption are no surprise, and they should be no surprise to life under the sun. We saw that in chapter 4, didn't we? Talking about oppression, and on the side of those who are oppressed, there's no one to comfort them. And even on the side of the oppressors, there's no one to comfort them. We saw that in chapter 4. We see that again right here. He says they have an official over them, and they have an official over them. So even the people who are doing the oppression, they still have people who are over them. So don't be shocked when you see this stuff. And so if this is connected with verses 1 through 7, generally the idea is here's God who's lasting and his things are meaningful. When you use your words to address God, it lasts. So it needs to be just words and well thought out words. But then he's saying, when God's not in the picture, don't be shocked because that's where oppression and corruption and all these evil things happen. So it's a massive contrast between God and then life under the sun if it's connected with verses 1 through 7. And then verse 9 is such a weird verse to me, and maybe somebody here can help explain it to me in a better way. But he says, after all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. And I've read where different people interpret that very differently because we're talking about oppression and we're talking about corruption here, and don't be shocked about it. And so some people say, okay, even if a king cultivates a field so that he can have all of the spoils from that field, maybe there's still some good that can come out of it. You know, maybe you can glean some of the harvest. Maybe you can get some things out of it. And I just don't know. It's sort of a weird verse. Any thoughts on verse 9 in connection with any of this? Yes, sir.
I thought thinking it's kind of verse 8 and 9 and say the contracts with the verse 8 is the idea of public officials to cover each other's back to steal from the people, while a king who's out working himself is an advantage to the entire land.
Yeah.
That's the way I took it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A big contrast there for sure. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, let's keep going and let's read verses 10 through 17. And again, we're going to come back to verses 8 and 9 because sometimes verses 8 and 9 are grouped in with 1 through 7, and sometimes they're grouped in with 10 through 17. And so let's read 10 through 17, please. It says, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. When good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what is the advantage to their owners except to look on? The sleep of the working man is pleasant, whether he eats little or much. But the full stomach of the rich man does not allow him to sleep. There is a grievous evil which I've seen under the sun, riches being hoarded by their owner to his hurt. When those riches were lost through a bad investment, he'd fathered a son, then there was nothing to support him. As he had come naked from his mother's womb, so he will return as he came. He will take nothing from the fruit of his labor that he can carry in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Exactly as a man is born, thus will he die. So what advantage to him? What advantage? Man, I'm butchering this. Middle of verse 16. So what is the advantage to him who toils for the wind? Throughout his life, he also eats in darkness with great vexation, sickness, and anger. So here in verses 10 through 17, we really see this whole idea of greed and how money will not satisfy somebody who is greedy or those who consume his riches as well. Because here in verse 10, he who loves money will never be satisfied with that money. If you love abundance, you will never be satisfied with that income. And he's saying that this is vanity. This is useless. This is fleeting. If that's your goal, is loving money, You're never going to be satisfied no matter how much you have. With abundance, you're never going to be satisfied with its income. And so verse 11, we get a question. We've been focusing on these questions a lot as we come to them. He says, when good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what is the advantage to their owners except to look on? And so in verse 11, have you ever seen those stories where somebody wins the Powerball and then all of a sudden their second cousin 8 times removed, 4, whatever, starts coming in the picture and be like, hey, I have been caring about you for years from a distance. So give me some of that money, right? Or just anything like that. Somebody gets an inheritance and all of a sudden it's like, hey, I could really use a handout or whatever it is. When good things increase, those who consume them increase. And he's saying that that money just goes away. You know, if you love money, you're never going to be satisfied with it. And on top of that, it goes away. On top of that, people have connected this to, you think about the stuff that you buy with your wealth that you can enjoy and is the gift of God that we've seen before. We're going to see it again in this chapter. But even in the stuff that we can enjoy and is the gift of God, sometimes when you get those good things, they cost you more money. It's just kind of so funny. You get that house you've been working for years and years and years. You got to pay property taxes. You know, you got to take care of that lawn. You got to do the home repairs. You got to do all those things. He's saying those who consume them increase. So what is the advantage? The more money you make, the more you got to pay in taxes, the more you got to upkeep and maintain things. And so the question is, okay, what's the advantage to their owners except to look on in verse 11, to see with their eyes what they have? And the answer is there isn't an advantage. You know, if you're loving money, you're never satisfied with it. We're going to see the contrast later in this chapter is contentment. But this is someone who is not content with it. And so they're never going to be satisfied, and it's not going to be beneficial. They're not going to fully enjoy it the way that they should. And so verse 12, I really like verse 12. He says, the sleep of the working man is pleasant, whether he eats little or eats much. You know, you put in an honest day's work, you're satisfied with what you have is really the idea here. You're satisfied with what you have. And he says, you can sleep well at night, putting in an honest day's labor and enjoying what you have. But verse 12, the full stomach of the rich man does not allow him to sleep. Now, literally, have you ever had a full stomach and tried to sleep on it? It's uncomfortable. You're not going to fall asleep that way. But that's not what he's really talking about here. He has so much that he's filled with that it's consuming his thoughts. You know, a bad day at the stock market's a really bad day for somebody who is super into it and has a lot more than somebody else. You know, that hurts a lot worse. Or, man, I've got all these investment properties and I got to worry about these tenants and I got to worry about, are they tearing up this one? Just the constant pressure and thoughts of all this stuff, maintaining their wealth and all the things they have prevents them from sleeping if they're not satisfied with their wealth. If that consumes their thoughts, it will consume their sleep as well. Any thoughts up to verse 12? There's a lot there. Okay, well, let's keep going. So in verse 13 there, we read 13 through 17 already, but he says, there's a grievous evil which I've seen under the sun, which is riches being hoarded by their owner to his hurt. So again, we're still talking about this person who is never satisfied with money. There's no contentment here. And so somebody who loves money and hoards this stuff to his hurt, they are more willing to go through these, verse 14, bad investment. Hey, high risk, high reward, right? If I can get a ton of return on this, I'm going to go after, this is a terrible example, so don't hold me to this, Bitcoin, right? This is a terrible example if you like Bitcoin, whatever. But there's a lot of people online and people who would love that, who they were like, oh, I put $5 in Bitcoin, now it's worth $100,000. And then 2 days later, they're like, and now it's back to $5, you know, because it's high risk, high reward, whatever, all that stuff. But the point here is, it hurts because they're not satisfied with what they have. They're willing to risk it all just for more and more and more, but it can actually bite them in the end. And so it hurts them, and they have nothing to support their children, verse 14. Father to son, because he wasn't content, had nothing to leave to his son. And so verse 15, I mean, wealth or not, but he says, verse 15, as he came naked from his mother's womb, that's the way he's going to return. He's going to take nothing. So all of this labor, this risk, all of this work that this person's doing who's not satisfied with money, they're going to die and they're going to leave this world exactly the same way as they came into this world. And they're not going to take any of that. And so verse 16, Solomon says, this is a grievous evil. Exactly as a man is born, thus he will die. So the question is, what is the advantage to him who toils for the win? Here's this guy who just never stops working, never stops taking these risks in pursuit of more and more and more because they're never satisfied. Solomon's saying, what's the advantage to all that? The answer is there is none. There's no advantage to that. And so verse 17, we see throughout his life, he eats in darkness with great vexation, sickness, and anger. Has anybody ever done this in your life, or do you know somebody in your life who you never get to see them, you never get to hang out with them, they never go see their family, they're sick all the time because all they do is work, 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 work. And it's not like they're working because they need to keep their head above water and not be super in debt and go bankrupt, but because they want more, 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 more. Anybody ever been that before? Yeah. And that's what Solomon is picturing here. And he's saying, you're going to die and you're not going to take any of that with you. So what's the advantage to all of that work? But there is no advantage. And so in this chapter, we see this huge contrast between God, who is lasting and meaningful. And when you talk in the presence of God, when you talk to God, those words matter. But then he starts talking about wealth. If you're never satisfied with money or you love money, he's saying that's vanity. It's striving after wind. It's a grievous evil, and it's just not worth killing yourself just to get more and more and more. Okay, any thoughts on anything up to this point? Okay. Well, let's see the opposite. Let's see the opposite in verses 18 through 20 together, please. 18 through 20. Solomon says, "Here's what I have seen to be good and fitting, to eat, to drink, and enjoy oneself in all one's labor in which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life, which God has given him." Hey, we see God come into the picture. "For this is his reward. Furthermore, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and receive his reward and rejoice in all his labor. This is the gift of God. For he will not often consider the years of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of his heart." Wow, what a different picture, right? I mean, what we just saw was a very bleak picture. God comes into the picture, accompanied by contentment. And wow, what a massively different picture here. It feels so different. So he says, it's good, it's fitting to go ahead and eat, go ahead and drink, enjoy yourself in all your labor. So labor's not bad. You know, working hard is not bad. It's good to work hard. We've seen that a couple of times. And enjoy the fruits of your labors. He says in, where is it? The few years of your life. During the few years of your life, it's good to enjoy yourself. It's good to reap the benefits from your hard work. He says that God has given that. He's given your years. This is his reward. And he says, you know, if God gives you riches and wealth, in a lot of cases, because we're going to get in chapter 6 and see this isn't true all the time. In a lot of cases, if he's given you riches and wealth, he's empowered you to eat from them, receive your reward, be content, enjoy those things. And he says that's the gift of God, verse 19. We've seen that a couple of times in Ecclesiastes. And I love verse 20. I mean, it's so poetic, verse 20. "He will not often consider the years of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of his heart." So enjoy what you have during the few years of your life. It's the gift from God. He's going to keep you occupied. Like I love that. And every time I read that, I think of a man named Bill Cooksey. I was growing up, he was in his 90s, and he had a walker. He could barely get into the church, that ramp. And I mean, you know, his appearance, because he was an older man, his appearance was sort of what you would picture an older man. He was really having a hard time. He'd drive himself, but then you started talking to him and the years just melted away. I mean, he just brightened up and it was great. Bill Cooksey, wonderful man. I miss him a lot. But that's who I think about verse 20. Any thoughts in this last section here, 18 through 20?
Psalm 16 and verse 11, that you will make known to me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there are pleasures forever. Just like everything that I'm reading here reminds me, like, whether you are rich or whether you're not, if your purpose is God, then He will give you purpose in life.
Yeah, well said. How did you say that last phrase? If your purpose of God, he will give you purpose in life?
If your purpose in life is God, then He will give you purpose.
That's good. Have you seen those things? It's like, no God, no purpose. No God, no purpose. Yeah, that's good. All right. Anything else?
In some way, it also makes me start thinking of a foreshadow of things that, you know, after this life. You don't remember much the days that we're on. That can, and then, or we want to be occupied with the joy of our heart.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's lasting, just like we saw in the beginning of the chapter. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts before we get into chapter 6? Yes, sir.
My head's been a little bit, so this might be for comparing, but I've seen, maybe like a sub-trend of a certain sect of Christianity where there is this almost borderline self-flagellation because it's like, I don't wanna, you know, I don't really know where it stems from, but there is this like concept of like not, it's like, I guess like a reaction to the super hoarding of wealth, and, I don't know if it like is from the Woman with One Eye or what it is, but like a real sacrifice of God, and I think that is totally apt as well. Like I don't want to take that off the table either, but I just never really like focused on these verses where he does say enjoy what you have been given, and I think there is like so much wisdom to that of, especially when you compare it to a joy of the Lord, you should show your joy with loving what he's given you and seeing it as the blessing that it is. And that's not to say it's not to impart on others and share with them too, but it is, I think it is very much a contrast to a self-flagellation sort of lifestyle where it can almost become more prideful, that you're all about how much you can show, how much you're giving away, and how much it is, about you being a sacrificial lamb of society or whatever it is. I just never seen it in that light, but that's really interesting and kind of comforting to hear in a way. I don't know, it's like a nice middle ground balance of like, not feeling like you have to like strip yourself of everything for some impression that you're trying to give off either.
Yeah, and talking about giving and giving of your wealth to others for their good. We're going to see that in Ecclesiastes in chapter 11 for sure, and I think in another spot I just can't remember right now. And so I like what you said about balance too, because we're going to see a lot of balance throughout Ecclesiastes as we go through.
It's just compared to it used to be kind of a hot, I think it was a book about the prayer of Jabez, where he prays that God would bless him so he can be a blessing. And I think this goes along with that. It's like, whether or not you're praying for it or not, but if God has blessed you, let that be a blessing to you and others too. Don't pour it all away, don't give it all. It's like there's this middle ground there that I think he's trying to get at. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
My thoughts are swirling, so
That's the way I got to write it down. Yeah. Do you have something?
Yeah, another thought that occurred to me is Jesus within his conversation with the rich young man, the rich young ruler. You had kept all the commandments until he got home and sell all of the possession. Well, is that a commandment for everybody to sell all the possessions, or did Jesus really understand that's what puts him in that black? And to teach that's what he told him. Just a thought.
Yeah, right. And then we see like in Ephesians 6 where there were rich people among them and there were commands given to them, but it wasn't sell everything you have, like to that rich young ruler for sure. Speaking of balance though, here in Ecclesiastes, let's look at chapter 6 because this is very connected and it is very pendulum swing the other way. So this feels really good here in chapter 5 verses 18 through 20. And now let's swing that pendulum the other way and feel real bad about ourselves just for a couple of verses here. So look at chapter 6 and let's look at verses 1 through 6 together, please. And specifically be thinking about some of the very same phrases that we just read in chapter 5. So chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, please. There is an evil which I've seen under the sun, and it is prevalent among men. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that his soul lacks nothing of all that he desires, yet God has not empowered him to eat from them, for a foreigner enjoys them. This is vanity and a severe affliction. If a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, however many they be, but his soul is not satisfied with good things, and he does not even have a proper burial, then I say, better the miscarriage than he. For it comes in futility and goes into obscurity, and its name is covered in obscurity. It never sees the sun, and it never knows anything. It is better off than he. Even if the other man lives 1,000 years twice and does not enjoy good things, do not all go to one place? So again, let's swing that pendulum the other way. Some of the same phrases and words in chapter 5 are used here. And so in chapter 6, these first couple of verses, some Some people like to take 1 through 6 as all the same thing. Some people break it down verses 1 and 2, and then verses 3 through 6 are separate things. I really don't know. It could be two separate things. It could all be one thing. I think it's true regardless. So in verses 1 and 2, he says there's an evil that is prevalent among men. So you've got a man whom God has given riches and wealth and honor. He's got all this stuff. His soul lacks nothing. And yet, in verse 2, God has not empowered him to eat from them. Now that's significant because in chapter 5 and verse 19, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. So it's like, what are we talking about here in chapter 6? What are we talking about? God has not empowered him here, for a foreigner enjoys them, and this is vanity and a severe affliction. What some people suggest here in verses 1 and 2 is you've got these people who have been working in a good way, and they're godly people with God in their lives. They accumulate riches and wealth and honor. But what happens sometimes to people? Just life under the sun. Ecclesiastes is very realistic. What happens sometimes? Even if you have everything to where your soul lacks nothing, sometimes people get sick. Sometimes there's health problems that come about just with normal aging. Sometimes a car accident happens and you can't enjoy things the way that maybe you wanted to. That happens in life under the sun, doesn't it? With people, I'm sure you know people who maybe there's nobody better than them in your eyes in life under the sun. That's the best person on the planet. And why'd they get in a car wreck? You know, they had the ability, they had the means, they were going to have everything they ever wanted, and then something happens. And so now they can't enjoy it quite the way that maybe they wanted to. Anybody ever heard of that happening? Yeah, for sure. That happens in life under the sun. And Solomon says that is vanity and a severe affliction. And here it says a foreigner enjoys them. So instead of them being the one who gets to enjoy it, somebody else does. And man, that is just rough to see. Any thoughts on those two verses in that way before we keep going? Okay. It's a bleak picture, but it's a very realistic one as well, isn't it? That we see that happen in life under the sun. So then verses, excuse me, verses 3 through 6 here. Verses 3 through 6. Some people group together 1 and 2 with 3 through 6, and all of this is one thing. So it's possible that this is somebody that God has given riches, wealth, and honor, but now that they have it, now in verse 3, their soul is not satisfied with that. So maybe all along the way, God has been in the picture, but now that they have it, okay, now my soul isn't satisfied. And once that comes into the picture, we've already seen what happens in chapter 5. He says he could father 100 children and live many years, but if you're not satisfied with good things, it's better the miscarriage than he. He says he won't even have a proper burial. And it's just not, it's not good. Comes in futility, goes in obscurity. He says better is a miscarriage that never saw the sun, never knows anything, better off than the man who doesn't or isn't satisfied with the wealth and honor and good things that God has given to him. And so in verse 6, even if the other man lives 1,000 years twice. So if you think about the ancient world, what wealth would look like, it would be many children and many years. And we mentioned Job, but was it Eddie that mentioned Job? I think, yeah, you mentioned Job earlier. What's one of the big things about Job, about how he was so wealthy? It was about his many children and his many years, right? A ripe old age. We see stuff like that about Abraham, many children, many. And so that is the picture of wealth in a lot of ancient cultures. And he says if they're not satisfied with that, they live 2,000 years even. They have, where was it? 100 children. Better off the miscarriage than he. So he says, don't they all go to the same place? They're just going to die like everybody else. So what's the point? It's vanity. It's striving after wind. It's futility is what it is. And if we bring in the word from verse 2, it's severe affliction as well. So a very intense contrast from the end of chapter 5, wouldn't you say? Very intense contrast. And yeah, any thoughts on any of that? Yes, sir.
The 1,000 years comment, the way it's written, should live 1,000 years twice. It just easily makes up 2,000.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it was Justin Marler who style made 1,000 years as a Genesis, what was it, 969?
Yeah, so close.
No man ever got that. And it's possible that there's, that has some significance in there. even if you achieve what no man has ever achieved twice.
Yeah.
Still. You still really.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, Brett was just talking about how nobody in the Old Testament ever actually reached 1,000. Methuselah got close. And so maybe he mentioned Justin Martyr. Who was it? Okay, yeah, Justin Martyr wrote something, and anyway, about 1,000 years, where that's something that nobody achieved in the Old Testament. And even if this man achieves it twice and isn't satisfied with his soul isn't satisfied with these good things, he's saying they go to the same place. It means nothing. It's still vanity. It's still fleeting. It's still lacking substance. Yeah, great point. Any other thoughts before we try to finish up chapter 6? Okay, well, let's finish up chapter 6 here. We're actually doing really well. I was thinking there's no way we're going to get close, so this is great. Let's look at verse 10 through 12, please. Or I'm sorry, we didn't even read verse 7. Let's do 7 through 9 really quick. 7 through 9. All a man's labor is for his mouth, and yet the appetite is not satisfied. For what advantage does the wise man have over the fool? What advantage does the poor man have, knowing how to walk before the living? What the eyes see is better than what the soul desires. This too is futility and striving after wind. Now, verses 7 through 9 really read a lot like chapter 1 to me. I mean, how many of these phrases are almost word for word from chapter 1 in that prologue, where he's saying life is cyclical, you see things, and the eye isn't satisfied with seeing, the ear isn't satisfied with hearing, and everything returns back to the way it was. So what's the point in any of this stuff? And that's sort of the meaning here in these verses here. Just human nature. We are unsatisfied by what we consume over and over and over again, even if it's good things. And so he says, for wise men or poor men, for rich men, for fools, he says, we're all going to die alike, and this is vanity and striving after the wind. Very much like chapter 1. And we saw that in chapter 2, we saw it in chapter 4, and we saw it in chapter 5 as well. So really, this is sort of a repeat that we've seen in this whole book here. But the question in verse 8, because we've been focusing on the questions, what advantage does the wise man have over the fool? What advantage does the poor man have, knowing how to walk before the living? And if this is all there is, Solomon's answer is that there is no advantage. There's no advantage at all. So are there any thoughts on 7 through 9 before we finish out chapter? Those are sort of repeated. Yes, sir.
Absolutely, like our salvation doesn't, I can't say the way and all that. But could this commentary, this scripture have nothing to do with how we consume and live our lives? In the sense of, this building is not you. You're now 3 prominent families at the time that had the money, had the ability to sign off on a loan. But the congregation in Brooklyn would not be there if my mom and dad didn't have money at the time.
Yeah.
To right? So I mean, it's very comforting for people who are poor, don't have money or struggling, really have a hard time to be like, money doesn't make us happy, money doesn't make us happy. I understand that. But there are so many examples where it was very prominent members of the church that were able to support missionaries, that were able to support preachers just locally to go by. So I mean, there are so many times there are people in this congregation right here that helped people only because they were very successful and were able to, and then there are people who would have got less dollar help other people too.
Yeah.
I understand that, but I just think maybe the reason for the wealth and everything is to pursue or to assist in God's growth and purpose, and it shouldn't always be like money is evil, money doesn't make you happy. Money can be beautiful.
Yeah. Amen. And what's interesting is, in every example that you just gave, God was in the picture, wasn't he?
Ultimately.
Yeah.
But maybe not at the time.
Hmm.
And maybe ultimately God, I don't know how that works, but sometimes men pursue money very selfishly, very egotistically, and came to know Jesus later on in their life, and can then use the money properly.
Yeah.
I have no idea why some come across money. Some don't.
Yeah, like Psalm 73.
I surely don't think only
For sure.
Christians, you know, but I just don't think it's always, I just think it's a lot better than it did.
Right. Yeah, and we see that here in Ecclesiastes even. Really quickly before we go, Let's read 10 through 12. Whatever exists has already been named, and it's known what man is, for he cannot dispute with him who's stronger than he is. For there are many words which increase futility. What then is the advantage to a man? So where it says many words, think back to chapter 5. Your words matter in the eyes of God. But verse 12 is really important for us getting into chapter 7. Who knows what is good for a man during his lifetime, during the few years of his futile life? He will spend them like a shadow. Who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun? The answer is nobody can tell you what's going to happen under the sun. But where it says, who knows what is good for a man during his lifetime? I think that's almost a topic question for chapter 7. Because in chapter 7, we're going to see the word good show up a couple times. We're going to see the word better show up a couple of times. And there's another word I can't think of right now. More. We're going to see good, better, and more. So who knows what's good for a man under his life in his lifetime? So I think chapter 7 is, here's a couple suggestions. Because here's some things that are good. Here's some things that are better. And we'll talk about those, Lord willing, next week. Thank you all very much for your comments.